I figured since it was before lunch, I'd take the time to give my thesis presentation too while I'm at it. So I'm the new program manager for Conserve Nevada. Some of you formerly know this as the Q1 program. This program, during the Q1 iteration, started in 2002. It was a voter initiative. It funded $200 million in projects around the state. There was over 200 projects funded, 100 miles of recreation trails put in, over 17,000 acres of land conserved, a number of water rights that were all conserved for the state. There's improvements to all of our state parks, all of our wildlife management areas, our fisheries, museums, and then there was some wildfire mitigation work that was done through that program. That program ended in 2019 and was reauthorized through AB 84 of the 80th session for $217.5 million over the next decade. When you look at the Q1 program, there were 19 projects funded directly along the Carson River. These projects did all sorts of things. There were also other projects funded through the other grant categories of Q1 that benefited the Carson River corridor. But there was over 1,300 acres preserved along the Carson River, and there was about 6.5 million in projects funded. So moving forward, Conserve Nevada is the new brand, the new iteration of this. It's that 217.5 million. There was a small portion, 17 million left in the old Q1 program that wasn't allocated because of 2008 and the economic downturn, because these funds are tied to general obligation bonds, which are tied to property value taxes. And so the 17 million was rolled over through the legislation into the new legislation to basically continue the program forward. So the way that this has been allocated is there are segments that were earmarked by the legislature, and then there's our competitive grant categories. The areas that were earmarked by the legislature is 145 million of that 217.5 million. 30 million of it is allocated towards state parks. 30 million of it is allocated towards Nevada Department of Wildlife. 30 million is going to the Nevada Division of Museums and History. This will predominantly be for the Boulder City Railroad Museum down in southern Nevada, and the restoration of the freight barn, the Ely Freight Barn. And then 30 million is to the Springs Preserve in Las Vegas. And then 10 million is allocated to the Clark County Wetlands and Lower Las Vegas Wash. And then an additional 10 million is allocated towards the Vegas Valley Rim Trail, which is a 100-mile pathway system through Clark County. And then 5 million of it was allocated towards the Division of State Lands for historic building restoration. And 2 million of this is going right now towards the California Railroad Depot. So 15 million of the general obligation bonds have been sold thus far. 2.5 million and 2.5 million were sold for both NDOT and state parks. A big chunk of that is going towards the restoration of the Cave Lake Dam and Cave Lake Reservoir. 3 million of it was allocated towards the design phase for the Boulder City Railroad Museum and for the design phase for the East Ely Depot restoration. 2 million is going towards the Las Vegas Springs Preserve for the renovation of their Origin Museum. 2 million is going towards the California Depot, which will predominantly be the exterior restoration of that building. And then 1 million is going towards the Clark County Vegas Valley Rim Trail. The reason that the funds were initially allocated, this 15 million, is because for the grant program to exist, we had to have regulations in place, and regulations weren't in place yet. So they issued these, and because of COVID-19, they weren't able to hire a program manager in 2019 because of the economy. And then in 2021, with me starting, is when they were able to start developing the grant program portion. So moving forward, the competitive grant elements, we have 5 million that are allocated towards the Lake Tahoe path system. Part of that path system currently goes from incline over to Sand Harbor. This will be for the extension of that, likely from Sand Harbor up to Spooner Summit. And then the Carson River and Truckee River corridors were allocated $10 million for corridor restoration efforts. Last time around, these were somewhat split up, but in this legislation, they put them together. So we'll be working through that. But one thing I would like to point out too is that there's another pool of money that could potentially be tapped into for projects. You're not capped at the 10 million. The 10 million is just for specifically for those corridors. So the eligibility for the 10 million pool is state agencies, local governments, nonprofits, conservation districts, and water conservancy districts are all eligible applicants for this pool of money. Right now, we're in the development phase of the regulations. We have our draft regulations out right now. The last program required like a 50% and a 25% match for projects. Many organizations were not able to compete and bring projects forward because of those large thresholds. We're walking that back a bit down to 10% match, where we'll allow in kind. And that's because part of this program, we want to be able to build capacity with our NGOs throughout the state and allow a diversity of projects to be eligible for the program. So this can be anything to enhance the corridor. And then this is the definition of the Carson River corridor as defined within the regulation. And that is kind of the overview of that. So the other category that the Carson River corridor could be eligible for is the 57.5 million open grant category. This can be used for outdoor recreation. So trail development, campsites, pretty much anything you can come up with in the outdoor recreation area. It can go towards governmental property acquisitions. So this could be municipalities, counties, state agencies going in and doing land and water acquisitions or conservation easements. Sagebrush ecosystem credits. So the Sagebrush ecosystem credit is for the restoration of sage grouse habitat. And this is one of the categories. And then we have a wildfire mitigation and restoration category. So if you're doing a project that we've had a wildfire come through and you're doing restoration work, you could apply in this category, which would have some overlap with the corridors. And then we have wetlands projects. So where you have interface between wetlands and river corridors, you could theoretically apply through that category also. And then the other one is nonprofit property acquisitions. And this also can be through direct acquisitions of land and water interests or through a conservation easement. So our timeline moving forward, we have begun the regulatory process of developing the regulations for the grant program. Those draft regulations are out. We did 4 listening sessions, one in Las Vegas, one up here, one out in Elko, and then one statewide virtual. And then we just concluded our workshop for the regulations. Moving forward, we'll be taking all of the feedback we've gotten from those. And if you have any additional feedback, it's not too late to send that in to me. But we will consider that in as we draft, make edits to those draft regulations and continue to proceed forward. But our goal overall is to have these regulations in place by this summer. So that way the grants are eligible within the next budget cycle. So we're hoping that by having the regulations in place, going to the legislature, having them authorize the bond sales for this new biennium, that we'll be able to do our first grant round in fall, winter of 2023. So what does that mean right now? There's one big, huge caveat that we cannot control via our regulations, and it's that projects from the grant, so from the bond sale, you have to expend those funds within 3 years. which in conservation work or acquisition work is extremely difficult. And this is a caveat from the IRS. Because we're issuing general obligation bonds and state debt essentially to cover these, to retain the basically non-exempt status on those, we have to extend them within 3 years, and that's not something that we're able to adjust. But one of the things that we're incorporating within our regulation is we're allowing phasing. So you can apply for NEPA, for planning, for environmental review, for any of those first, develop your plans and come back. The other thing we're allowing is that you can match these funds with pretty much anything under the sun. So in-kind, federal grants, other state grants, you just can't match it with two grants from our program. So that is kind of an overview of where we're at with the program. And right now, one of the things that we're asking all of the organizations is for us to build a convincing argument on our budget ask for the coming biennium. If you have any projects that are tentative, we're currently developing a statewide needs assessment to show that there is real need out there for these projects. One thing that I ask is if you have some projects that are coming forward that you may have within the next 2 years, to send those over to me. And you can send those to brandon.bishop@dcnr.nv.gov, or you can come talk to me and I can get you some more contact information. But that kind of concludes if there's any questions.